Happy Thursday. I hope everybody had a good day today. We are going to start with some review of blood from last week first. Then we will go into the endocrine system. If you have any questions, you can let me know as I go along. I'm going to kind of review the stuff that's kind of important for the test this weekend. So in our blood, we have between 4 to 6 million red blood cells. Women, it's more like 4 to 5 million, while men, it's more like 5 to 6 million. Our red blood cells actually come from our bone marrow, and that's found in the shafts of long bones. When our red blood cells or erythrocytes are actually destroyed, because they do get destroyed after about 120 days of circulating through our blood. And when they are circulating through our blood, they are transporting oxygen, carbon dioxide on the red blood cells. But when they're 100 to 120 days are up, they get destroyed, and what gets released is heme. It's Heme. That heme will actually get converted to bilirubin. That bilirubin is then secreted as bile. If we have too many or not enough red blood cells, it can cause problems. Whenever you see the word, or at the end of a word, penia, like leukopenia, erythropenia. Leukopenia means we have a low number of leukocytes. Erythropenia means we have a low number of erythrocytes. So penia always tells us that we have something is low. It is used to talk about all kinds of things. We'll keep hearing that word as we get to other conditions and other systems. But just knowing that that means that something is low or below normal, anytime you see penia on a word, it's just knowing what the beginning of the word actually means to tell you what is low. So if somebody has an increased number of neutrophils tell us there's a bacterial infection. If we have an increased number of basophils, it's another type of white blood cell. Basophils can tell you have a parasitic infection. Could be from, it's hard to read, allergies. Are the two main reasons for a basophil an increase in basophils, we have high lymphocytes, we could have a viral infection. It could be some kind of inflammatory response is happening as well. What if we have increased monocytes? An increased monocyte will signify, could be some kind of infection. Monocytes actually like to travel outside of the bloodstream. Where they become macrophages. And macrophages kind of travel around in your connective tissues, and they phagocytize cells that have been died off. They phagocytize any kind of pathogen they come across. They kind of do most anything that is found kind of floating around in those connective tissues. Our last white blood cell, eosinophils. Eosinophils can actually signify allergies, asthma, that's their main purpose. So if we have not enough red blood cells, so say if we have those decrease in red blood cells, what's going to happen is we won't have enough oxygen. So we're going to have a decreased amount of oxygen in our system because those red blood cells take oxygen to different places. If we don't have enough red blood cells, we don't have enough oxygen for our system. So if we have an increase in red blood cells, that could mean that somebody is blood doping. When somebody's blood doping, they remove blood from their system. They allow their body to remake the blood that was taken out. But then right before some kind of athletic event, they shoot the blood back into their system, and it gives them an increased amount of red blood cells. That increased amount of red blood cells provides more oxygen for the system. So they're trying to give themselves more oxygen so they can perform well at whatever event. Another thing here, our blood pH is also important. Because if our blood pH is off, it can actually cause all kinds of problems. So our blood has a very small range of 7.35 to 7.45. And it stays, our body uses homeostasis to maintain that blood pH. So homeostasis is where it maintains a balance. So our body does different things to maintain a balance in our system. Besides having red blood cells and white blood cells in our system, erythrocytes and leukocytes, we also have platelets. And platelets are also known as fibrinogen. So platelets, medical term, are fibrinogen. So platelets kind of float around in our blood and they stay within the blood until they're needed. And when platelets or fibrinogen is needed is if we have a red or a blood vessel here, something has pierced that red blood cell. We have different red, or pierced that blood vessel. So we have different red blood cells in here. We also have platelets. What these platelets will do, they do not actually stick to the inside of the blood vessels because of the epithelium that makes up the blood vessels. We'll go into what that's all made of when we get to the cardiovascular system, which is after endocrine. But the reason why platelets start to stick is they're actually underneath pretty much all epithelial tissue is collagen. It's connective tissue, and connective tissue has a lot of collagen. So there's lots of collagen fibers down in here. Platelets, or those fibrinogens, stick to these collagen fibers. So we get platelets that start to stick to this or to the collagen, and that starts to plug up our red blood vessel. But as the fibrinogen starts to attach to the collagen, the chemicals are also released into the blood that stimulates more platelets to come to the area, more red blood cells to come to the area. Because once the fibrinogen has been activated to clog the opening in the blood vessel, it also starts to cause red blood cells to come stick. That's what causes our scabs, is the red blood cells that dry out and stick. But this helps to cover this hole in the red blood vessel so blood no longer seeps out. So if we do not have enough fibrinogen in our system, the first thing that's going to happen is we're not going to be able to clot our blood. That's the first thing that's going to happen. We need fibrinogen to clot our blood vessels. So if we continue to lose blood, we'll see other symptoms, but the first step is usually our blood can't clot because there's nothing to stick to that collagen that's on the outside of those blood vessels, which causes the problem. So let's look at blood typing a little bit. When we're looking at blood typing, we have A, B, O, and AB blood type. If we take our different, so I was looking for our different blood types here. AB blood type has both A and B antigens on it. So AB blood type can actually receive blood from A, B, AB, and O. So AB blood type is considered that universal recipient because they can take blood from, if we're looking at just AB, A, B, and O blood type, not looking at RH, AB can receive blood from anybody. But ABO blood or B blood type, they have those B antigens. They have anti-A antigens. So, or agglutinins. So if they will actually attack any A blood type blood cells that get into their system, those anti-A agglutinins, these will actually attack any type A blood. So they can only receive B and O. While type A blood, they have these anti-B agglutinins. So if type B blood got into their system, these agglutinins will actually attack those B blood cells. So type A blood can only receive type A and O blood, while O doesn't have any markers on them. But they do have anti-A and anti-B agglutinins. So O blood type, if they receive any other type of blood but O, it will get attacked by these anti-A and anti-B anti-glutens or agglutinins. O can only receive O blood type, but they are a universal donor. They can donate to anybody. So the RH part of the blood, there's many different agglutinogens. There's 52 technically in blood, but we only really look at one specific one because that RH on that D antigen is what seems to be the most, can cause the most problems. So if somebody is RH positive, technically they should only receive positive blood. While somebody who is RH negative should only receive negative blood. We start looking at the ABO blood typing with the RH factor. O negative is technically the only blood type that is truly a universal donor. Because even if you have positive blood, you can technically receive a negative blood once. After that one time, you can't receive negative blood again, but it is possible in case of an emergency if there's really no other blood around and it is a true emergency. So there's different kinds of conditions that affect the blood, where you could have with not enough red blood cells, there's different kinds of anemia. With the size of blood cells, you could have they're too big or too small. That can cause problems. We also can have an anemia that deals with vitamin B12 or pernicious anemia. We get pernicious anemia when our body cannot take up vitamin B12 because we don't have intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor is produced in the stomach and it goes into the intestines to help take B12 up into the system. It just, if we don't have it, we can't really, we don't, if we don't have that intrinsic factor, no matter how much B12 we take in, we're not gonna take it and actually absorb it into our system without intrinsic factor. So we really need intrinsic factor to get to B12. Looking at trying to find the different kinds of anemia for you really quick. It's the blood doping. Here's thalassemias. Here's the anemias I was looking for. Okay, so we have the blood loss anemia or hemorrhagic anemia because they lost too much blood. Chronic hemorrhagic is because there's some kind of internal bleeding that's constantly going on. Iron deficiency anemia caused by hemorrhagic anemia, losing too much blood, but also could be because of low iron intake or your body just doesn't absorb iron. And that could be a secondary cause to something else. I recently learned that if you have celiac disease, you can't absorb most nutrients in your system, including iron. So it can actually cause iron deficiency anemia. So as I said, the pernicious anemia, they're lacking intrinsic factor. That's how our body absorbs B12 because it can't absorb it on its own. We have renal anemia because there's not enough erythropoietin. We have aplastic anemia is because something happened to our red bone marrow. That's found in our long bone. Something damaged it. And then we have thalassemias, which is more of a Mediterranean ancestry thing. And then sickle cell. Sickle cell is where we have a genetic or a mutation and causes that C shape in the red blood cells that get stuck in places. So think, oh, here's some other little tips. Erythrocytes or red blood cells, they are anucleate. They do not have a nucleus. They have one when they are developing, but they spit it out before they mature and go out into the bloodstream. And I think that's all I wanted to go through for blood. So if there's, I am going to switch over to the endocrine system. The endocrine system, as we looked at a little bit on Tuesday, is what creates, ooh, question. Second, there's a, okay. So the endocrine system is what helps to maintain homeostasis in our body. And if we remember back to Anatomy 1, Chapter 1 of Anatomy 1, really, homeostasis is where we try to keep a balance of everything in our system. And we do that through our nervous system. We also do that through our hormones. Hormones are more of a long-term response, while our nervous system can trigger a lot of the same things, but that's more of an immediate, quickest response that happens quick and ends. So our system will do more hormones because there's a long-term solution to problems. So our endocrine system, it does work with the nervous system to coordinate when different hormones get released. It can influence our metabolic activities. So how we digest our food, how our body breaks down food. The study of hormones is actually called endocrinology. There are people and doctors that really enjoy studying hormones, and this is what they do. A doctor that studies or that works with hormones is an endocrinologist. So as I was kind of saying, our nervous system provides a very rapid response to something that's happening. It's usually, as I said, that short duration. We send action potentials out and neurotransmitters to adjust to something that happened. And those, if you remember from the nervous system, neurotransmitters don't go very far. They can't travel long distances. Hormones can travel long distances. They travel through our bloodstream. They travel around our lymphatic system. They'll actually travel to cells in between cells. So they can reach target tissues anywhere in the body. Hormones are a lot longer lasting, but it's very slow to get the process started because it takes the nervous system telling the endocrine system to do something. The endocrine system needs to produce it and then release it. So it's a lot more extensive, lengthy process. So our endocrine system tends to control reproduction, not just a baby, but cell reproduction. It helps with growth and development. Hormones determine how tall we get, how we develop as males or females. They maintain our electrolytes, our water balance, metabolism of our cells, and they metabolize our body's defenses. So our immune system, it helps with that as well. So I'm not sure if you remember from the tissues chapter, chapter 4, there's two different types of glands. We have exocrine glands. They usually have some kind of duct, and they secrete their stuff out via a duct. That's how we sweat. That's how saliva is made. That's how the mucus in your respiratory tract and your digestive tract is formed. It's all then excreted through exocrine glands. We also have endocrine glands. Those are what produce our hormones. They don't have the same ducts that exocrine glands have. They are more released out of the cells, could be through secretory vesicles. It could be released many different ways, but they're just not secreted up through a duct. So the different endocrine glands in our body. We have a pituitary gland, thyroid, parathyroid, adrenal glands, and we have a pineal gland in our brain. We have the hypothalamus, which is considered a neuroendocrine organ. We have exocrine and endocrine functions within the pancreas, the gonads. Gonads are another name for the reproductive system. And even when females are pregnant, the placenta will secrete hormones. We also have other tissues around the body that produce hormones, like your adipose tissue or fat tissue, fat cells. They secrete hormones. The thymus, which is most important in children, but that secretes hormones. There's cells in the small intestines, in the stomach, in the kidneys. Even the heart will secrete hormones to help regulate. So I showed this picture in class on Tuesday. It shows where all the different glands are located in the body. This is what will be on the practical on Tuesday. We'll be dealing with these different glands. I tried to go over some of it on Tuesday. A lot of it talked about identifying the different glands and what are the major hormones they secrete. So we'll go through a lot of the major hormones they secrete. Just so you know, there's smaller ones you don't necessarily need to worry about, but it's the major ones that are the ones that will be tested on. So our endocrine system functions based on chemical messengers. We, of course, have our hormones. They can travel anywhere in the body. They signal different things for different cells. And they tend to travel in the blood. Sometimes they travel in the lymph. Once in a while, you'll catch them traveling to a cell close by from where they were released without having to enter the blood or lymph. We have autocrine. Those are chemicals that have some kind of effect on the cells that secrete them. So the same cell that secretes that chemical has that effect on that cell, same cell. Paracrines. They are chemicals that act kind of in the local area, and they affect the cells that secrete them. So autocrine and paracrine cells are actually chemical messengers. They're not really part of the endocrine system, but they still help with signaling that we may need some specific hormone to come to some specific cell for something. So that's why they're kind of mentioned here, as they still somewhat participate in activating that endocrine system. So we technically have two main classes of hormones. We have amino acid based hormones that are made of peptides, proteins. Most amino acids are chained together proteins. Steroids can be made from cholesterol. I've also did some reading around today. There's technically another class that I found that are lipids, because lipids specifically cross the membrane. I don't know if you covered in Anatomy 1 about cell structure and the cell membrane, but lipids can actually diffuse right across the cell membrane. So some hormones are actually made of lipids, go through the cell membrane to into the cell before they do their job. But there's also another possible type, which are eicosanoids. It just depends on who you're talking to, and if you think that these eicosanoids are actually some kind of hormone or not. Your book just mentioned them. Hormones can only act on cells that have a specific receptor for that hormone. So we have a cell. The cell has a specific receptor that'll bind a specific hormone. It'll only bind that one specific hormone on that receptor. So no other hormone can bind to that, only what fits to that receptor. So we have what are called target cells, and those are the cells that each specific hormone is designated for. And once those hormones bind, if I have a hormone that'll bind to this receptor here, once that hormone binds to that receptor, it can alter the cell's activity. It can signify to do something, the cell to do something specifically. It just kind of depends on what that hormone is sent to do. So some of the things that the hormones can actually do is it can change that membrane's permeability. So it can let certain ions in or out, or it can block certain ions from getting in or out of the cell that are normally able to get through. So if we have different ion channels that were open and letting ions in or out of the cell, a hormone may come along, bind to its receptor. Once it binds to that receptor, it's going to close off that ion channel so things can't get in and out anymore. It can stimulate the synthesis of enzymes or proteins, because our cells make enzymes, they make proteins as needed for different activities. Enzymes have an active and an inactive state. So a hormone binding to this receptor here can actually activate a hormone or an enzyme, or it can deactivate an enzyme. So it turns off that enzyme until we need it again. It can induce secretory activity, so release of proteins, release of different cellular structures out that could be needed, release of ions. It can stimulate mitosis because sometimes cells are actively turned off from mitosis for a while and a hormone can come along, bind to its active site and stimulate that cell, say, hey, we need more cells created. We need you to replicate, and it stimulates the whole process of mitosis again. The hormones tend to be water soluble or lipid soluble. Water soluble hormones are the type of hormones that are found to be more free floating in our blood vessels. So we have blood vessels, another blood vessel here. We have some kind of protein in here. We have our red blood cells. We have, again, our platelets. Some hormones, water-soluble hormones, are free-floating in our blood. They don't need to attach to anything. But we also have lipid-soluble hormones. If you know anything, if you remember, if you've ever done any experiments with lipids or oils mixing with water, they don't mix no matter what you do. No matter how fast you mix it, it'll eventually dissipate and the oil and the water will separate. Because lipids hate water. They don't like water. So what they do in the bloodstream, hormones have to bind to proteins to get carried through the blood when they're lipid soluble. That way, they get to their target destination and to where they need to go. Lipid soluble hormones, we also go back to our cell membrane here. It's a phospholipid bilayer technically, but these lipid soluble hormones can actually cross the cell membrane by simple diffusion. Diffusion is going from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So they enter into the cell, where in the cell they bind to a specific receptor in the cell where they will activate that cell to do whatever that hormone was sent for. Different hormones do different things. So just depends on what that hormone was sent for. So hormones are controlled by negative feedback systems. Negative feedback systems are where we are trying to return things back to normal. So an example, your blood sugar gets too high, your pancreas is going to secrete insulin to lower your blood sugar. If you do not have enough sugar in your blood, or glucose technically in your blood, your pancreas is going to secrete glucagon. Glucagon goes to the liver, where the liver breaks down glycogen into glucose and releases it into the blood. So it's a negative feedback system. It's trying to balance out and keep a balance of how much blood sugar we have is just one example. We're trying to balance everything out. There are two hormones when we get to it that actually induce a positive feedback system. That positive feedback system is where it increases the effect. So I'll point those out when we get to them. But every other hormone that is released into our system actually has a negative feedback system. Most hormones are stimulated to be released by a humoral stimuli, a neural stimuli, or a hormonal stimuli. So there's synthesized and released by something else. They're not just created and released on their own. They always have some kind of control mechanism that monitors the release of the hormones. So if we're looking at humoral stimuli, so this type of stimuli deals with changes in the blood specifically. So the example is if with calcium in the blood, if there's not enough calcium in the blood, it actually stimulates parathyroid hormone to secrete, which stimulates osteoclasts to start breaking down bone to secrete more calcium into the blood. So it increases to get our blood calcium levels back to normal. So a humoral stimulus is caused by altering levels of ions or nutrients. While a neural stimuli, there are nerve fibers that stimulate hormone release. We have within our sympathetic nervous system, there's actually nerves that stimulate the adrenal medulla to secrete certain catecholamines. They also work in your hypothalamus and pituitary gland. Nerves stimulate the release of different hormones from your brain too. So here's this example of hormones are released or caused by the nerves. The adrenal medulla specifically secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine. Those two hormones specifically are used with your rest and digest or fight or flight modes. They actually respond in both situations. So that's just one example, but it happens all over. We also have hormonal stimuli. Your anterior pituitary gland, most of the hormones that it secretes works on other endocrine glands to secrete hormones. So like thyroid stimulating hormone comes from your anterior pituitary. Thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates your thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone. So it's your brain that tells your anterior pituitary to release the hormone that goes to the target organ to stimulate that organ to release their hormones. So that anterior pituitary also goes to the adrenal cortex. It goes to gonads. In this case, it's showing the testes, but it does go to other places as well. So just like our nervous system monitors what's going on outside of our body, it also monitors what's going on inside our body all the time. So our nervous system can monitor and change the hormone levels as needed. We get too many hormones into the system. The brain will stimulate whatever gland to slow down production, or we don't have enough in our system of something. Our nervous system will stimulate that gland to secrete more. So our nervous system is constantly working to maintain a balance in the amount of hormones that are released and what to do if there's too many or not enough. Our nervous system can actually override some of our normal endocrine controls too. So when you're under a great deal of stress, if you've ever been at a time where you're under a lot, like severe stress, your body tends to monitor the insulin levels. But when you're under severe stress, your body kind of inhibits the release of insulin and lets your blood sugar actually go higher. That increase in blood glucose is kind of used for that fight or flight mode. And when you're under a great deal of stress, you're in that constant fight or flight mode. So your body has to kind of adapt for it, and your nervous system actually does a wonderful job at keeping your body in that fight or flight mode, unfortunately. Sometimes it can't help you get back out of it. You have to find ways yourself to get back out of that constant fight or flight mode. So as I've kind of talked about, hormones will bind to specific cells and then specific receptors on those cells. Different cells have different receptors, different hormones. Each hormone will bind to its own specific receptor. So ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone, it's released by the anterior pituitary and it goes to the adrenal cortex and stimulates the release of cortisol. Thyroxine, that's one of your thyroid hormones. Your thyroid hormones actually affect almost every single cell of your body. So almost every single cell in your body has a receptor site for thyroid hormone or thyroxine. So different target cells get activated depending on the hormone levels in your blood, the number of receptors on that target cell, and how likely is that hormone to bind to that receptor. So the affinity. those are the three factors that actually determine whether or not a hormone will bind to a specific receptor. They need to have enough hormone in the blood to want to move some of those hormones, push them out into different cells. The cells need to have that specific receptor on it, and then that hormone needs to want to bind to that specific receptor. So, as I was kind of saying before, the amount of hormone that's in the body influences the number of receptors for that hormone. So if there's a very low number of hormones in your system, the cells actually upregulate. So more receptors actually appear on those target cells because they're desperate in need of those hormones. But if there's a very high level of those hormones in the blood, in the system, cells start to lose those receptors through downregulation because there's so many hormones, they don't need to like fight for which cell gets what hormone. So through downregulation can actually desensitize target cells, and it kind of prevents them from overreacting to a persistently high level of hormone. So that's another way your body kind of regulates actually how many hormones get bound to cells. There could be a lot of thyroid hormone in your system, but not every cell is going to have hundreds of receptors to pick it up. They may only have one or two since the levels are so high. Versus if you have very low amounts of thyroid hormone in your system, since thyroid hormone binds everywhere, you kind of end up with a lot of receptors on a cell because they're all desperate for that hormone. So I've kind of mentioned this before. Hormones are either free, which they kind of float in the blood, not attached to anything, or they're bound. Most of the lipid, or actually all the lipid hormones, are bound to some kind of carrier. So if there's a lot of a specific hormone circulating in the system, it's going to decrease how much hormone's actually released. If there's a low amount of hormone in the blood, that they've all been taken up by cells, so it's very low, it's going to speed up the rate of production and release of that hormone. So it's, again, trying to keep that balance between too much and not enough. The amount of hormones circulating in the body can also affect the speed that hormone could be inactivated and removed from the body, because our body can actually remove hormones if there's too many. They can be removed by enzymes. Your kidneys, because your kidneys filter your blood all day long. Your liver. Your liver is also another place that actually helps to kind of clean your blood. It helps to detoxify your system. So when we're talking about hormones in our system, we have what's called a half-life. A half-life is how long it takes for that hormone to decrease by half in your blood. So half-life means different things in different places. With hormones, it means how long it takes to decrease the amount of the hormone by half. So It can vary just depending on each hormone. It can take a fraction of a minute or it could take a week. Just depends. Different hormones have different levels. They're circulating at different rates. They're being released at different rates. So everything kind of gets affected by that. Hormone response time can be immediate. As soon as it's released, it causes some kind of effect. Some can take days or hours. Like steroids can take hours to days to actually see the effect. Some are inactive until they enter their target cell. That one of those hormones is thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone releases two different types of hormone. One that is active from the start, the other that needs to be changed into its active form at the cell. When we get to thyroid hormone, we'll go into more detail about that. But there's all different hormones do, unfortunately, different things. So the duration of response. Some hormones, you get an effect that lasts 10 seconds. Some hormones effect lasts several hours. It just depends again on the hormone, what the target cell is, where it needs to travel in the body. There's a lot of different things that kind of affect all of this. So the effects can disappear pretty fast. Like if we've got a lot of glucose in our blood, that response is usually pretty quick. We get insulin secreted out, the insulin picks up the glucose in the blood and takes it into cells to be converted into ATP. So that's usually a pretty quick response, but the effects may persist for hours, even at low blood levels. So it just kind of depends. So that half-life, how long it takes for the hormone level to drop by half in the blood, the onset and duration are all dependent on whether the hormone is water soluble or lipid soluble. There's lots of little things that affect hormones. So here's some different information. Our lipid soluble hormones come from the adrenal cortex, gonads, and thyroid gland. Lipid hormones are not stored in secretory vesicles. They have to be transported in the blood on plasma proteins. They have a long half-life. The liver needs to break them down if there's too many. Since they are lipid, they can travel by diffusion directly into a cell. And they usually activate genes and they cause synthesis of new proteins. While water-soluble hormones come from all other endocrine glands. They are usually stored in some kind of secretory vesicle, which is some kind of vesicle that is made in the cell. It's usually actually part of the plasma membrane, but it's made within the cell. It encloses around, in this case, the hormones. And as this secretory vesicle, we have our cell here, will bind to the plasma membrane and release its contents out. That's how secretory vesicles work. They are free in the blood because they're water soluble. They don't need something to protect them in the blood plasma. Their half-life is really short. Water soluble hormones can be removed by the kidneys. We can excrete those out, which is not necessarily a good thing when we're talking about insulin and glucagon, but that's for another day. Water soluble hormones will bind to that plasma membrane. They do not enter the cell, they just bind to that receptor on the plasma membrane, and then they send their signal. Once the hormone is bound here, they'll send their signal into the cell to do whatever task needs to be completed. So let's start looking at the different parts of the endocrine system. The hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is actually connected to the pituitary gland. It's connected, the pituitary gland here kind of has a little stalk to it. It's my anterior and posterior portions, but it has a stalk here that attaches it to the brain. That is called the infundibulum, is that stalk. We have our posterior pituitary gland. That's actually made of neural tissue. It's not endocrine or glandular tissue, it's neural tissue. And the hormones that come out of the posterior pituitary actually come from the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus sends the hormones down via nerves into the posterior pituitary. So since they come from the hypothalamus and they're secreted by the posterior pituitary, the hormones that they secrete are called neurohormones. Just because it's neural tissue, so they're neural hormones. So that posterior part of the pituitary gland over here and that infundibulum, they make up what is called the neurohypophysis. You don't need to ID these specific parts. I'm not going to ask it. It's more of a for your information. But our anterior pituitary, this anterior pituitary is made of glandular tissue. So that glandular tissue releases all kinds of hormones. Let's look a little further first at the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So that posterior lobe is technically a downgrowth from the brain. It's the part that comes, it's considered to be part of the brain because it, through those nerves that I drew on the picture before, it connects directly to that hypothalamus through what's called the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract. So that tract is made of neurons and it runs through that infundibulum. The hormones that are made in the hypothalamus that get released in the posterior pituitary gland is oxytocin and ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. So here's kind of our drawing that shows the whole thing. We have hypothalamic neurons. They come down into the posterior pituitary. Oxytocin and ADH are actually transported along the axons of these neurons. And then they're stored in those neurons until they need to be released for something. So, and then they get released and they get picked up by this blood vessel and secreted. They don't secrete directly into the blood, they secrete into the tissues around the blood or around the gland, and then they migrate and make their way into the blood vessels, is what they're doing. So that anterior pituitary, we said before, it is made of glandular tissue. It's formed from what kind of called an outpocketing of oral mucosa. It has a primary capillary plexus, hypophyseal portal veins, and a secondary capillary plexus. These are all different blood vessels that go through the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland just to pick up the different hormones that are being secreted by that anterior pituitary. The hypothalamus actually secretes releasing and inhibiting hormones to the antipituitary to regulate hormone secretion. So that hypothalamus, it's technically considered part of the endocrine system because it releases its own hormones to tell the anterior pituitary to send out more hormones or not to send out more hormones, because that anterior pituitary, a lot of their hormones act on other endocrine glands. So anterior pituitary hormones will stimulate another gland to secrete hormones, like the thyroid stimulating hormone I mentioned. That thyroid stimulating hormone goes to the thyroid gland and tells the thyroid gland to release its hormones. So if there's not as much thyroid releasing hormone sent out into the blood, then the thyroid won't secrete as many hormones. It's kind of like a chain link sequence. So this just shows the different blood vessels that goes to the anterior lobe of the pituitary. And all of these blood vessels will actually pick up the hormones that are being secreted by that anterior pituitary and take them up into the blood vessels to travel around the body where they need to go. So I think I've already said that the posterior pituitary consists of those axon terminals of neurons from the hypothalamic neurons. So they come from neurons that come from the hypothalamus. So we got our infundibulum with our pituitary gland here. We have our anterior and posterior part. We have neurons that are coming down into our posterior pituitary that carry the oxytocin and the antidiuretic hormone down to the posterior pituitary gland to be secreted when they're needed. So what does oxytocin actually do? Oxytocin is a hormone that, or actually this is where I mentioned before about positive feedback. It's oxytocin. Oxytocin goes to the uterus to help stimulate stronger contractions. So what actually stimulates the release of oxytocin is the cervix stretching. So as the cervix stretches, that sends neural signals to the brain to release oxytocin. That oxytocin gets released, and that goes to the uterus to produce stronger contractions to deliver that child. It also goes to the mammary glands to trigger milk ejection from those mammary glands in the breast. So that's why it's a positive feedback, because oxytocin enhances something, makes it more, happen more, like increases the contractions for childbirth. It increases the amount of milk production. That's what oxytocin does. So it kind of acts as a neurotransmitter in the brain, but it kind of works because it goes down to the uterus and the mammary glands and the breast. We don't really know what oxytocin does in men. We only know what it does in females. So antidiuretic hormone, that's the other hormone that is made in the hypothalamus, and it is sent down through neurons to the posterior pituitary gland where it gets released. Antidiuretic hormone deals with our kidneys, because our hypothalamus contains osmoreceptors for osmotic pressures. Our body tries to maintain an isotonic solution. So an isotonic solution is where pressures, osmotic pressure inside and outside of the cell is the same. So when we have the same osmotic pressures on both sides, it prevents the cells from taking in too much water or releasing too much water. So that hypothalamus has those osmotic receptors to help make sure we keep that isotonic solution in our body between our cells and the extracellular fluids. So if concentrations of solutes get too high, that actually triggers that posterior pituitary to secrete that antidiuretic hormone. It goes to the tubules in the kidney, and it tells the kidneys, hey, we need more water. Absorb more water. Don't let that much water leave the system. So it kind of prevents urine formation because it's trying to pull more water back into the system. Antidiuretic hormone can be released because of pain, low blood pressure, and certain drugs can do that. If you've ever drank a lot of alcohol, you constantly have to go to the bathroom. It's because alcohol actually inhibits the release of antidiuretic hormone because it's trying to secrete. It gets rid of it, creates, if there's no antidiuretic hormone being secreted, it's causing more urine formation. We're not reabsorbing a lot of water. We're trying to get rid of a lot of water. There are also drugs that are called diuretics. These are usually given to people that tend to retain a lot of water because it could be due to some kind of kidney function. And these diuretics inhibit antidiuretic hormone from being released. So it lets the extra fluids that are in the body to be filtered out by the kidney to create urine. So if we have high concentrations of that antidiuretic hormone being secreted out, it causes vasoconstriction. So the blood vessels get smaller. When those blood vessels get smaller, it's also called vasopressin. So just another word for vasoconstriction. We're constricting those blood vessels, so we're getting rid of extra water. We're with antidiuretic hormone, we're trying to get more water back into our system. We don't have enough water to release a lot of water through urine. So diabetes insipidus. I'm sure you've heard the term before, but what it actually is it's a deficiency of antidiuretic hormone, because there's been some kind of damage to that hypothalamus or that posterior pituitary. So water is instead of being taken back in by the kidney, reabsorbed back into the system, water is being filtered out all the time. So people with diabetes insipidus need to stay very well hydrated because their body's constantly cleaning out and excreting water. We also have what is called syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretion. That's an actual syndrome. That's where we have retention of fluids. Like I had talked about before with some people are given diuretics. So they're retaining fluid somewhere in the body. Can cause headaches. Can cause disorientation, not really knowing where you're at, what's going on around you. They can't take in as many fluids because their body is excreting any and all fluid that they take in. So their blood sodium levels constantly have to be monitored as well. They need to keep fluid levels within some kind of balance. And it's kind of hard to do. So now for the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary secretes 6 peptide hormones. All but 2 are tropic hormones. I mentioned tropic hormones on Tuesday. Tropic hormones are hormones that are released that act on another endocrine gland, like thyroid stimulating hormone. It's tropic because it stimulates the thyroid gland. Comes from the anterior pituitary, goes to the thyroid. The adrenocorticotropic hormone, this one stimulates the adrenal glands, specifically the adrenal cortex. Follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH. They're known as gonadotropic hormones, because it says tropic right in there. In females, they stimulate the ovaries. In males, they stimulate the testes. Luteinizing hormone. That's also another tropic hormone. Luteinizing hormone is also a gonadotropic hormone because it stimulates the ovaries in females and the testes in males. So those are the different somatotrophic hormones because they act on other endocrine glands. We also get growth hormone from the anterior pituitary, and we get prolactin from the anterior pituitary. So let's look at what each of these hormones do. Growth hormone, it's sometimes called somatotropin because it's technically produced by somatotrophic cells, but it affects your metabolism. And it also affects, as you're growing as a child and as a teenager, it promotes growth, helps you grow taller. Or if there's not enough, it keeps you from growing taller. It acts on your metabolism. So it kind of has anti-insulin effects. So it decreases the rate of glucose uptake and metabolism. So growth hormone, it lets the glucose stay in the blood, is what it does. It doesn't pick it up and take it into cells like insulin does. It lets it stay in the blood. But growth hormone also does kind of what I talked about with other hormones. It goes to the liver, breaks down glycogen. Glycogen gets broken down into glucose. Glucose gets released into the blood, where it is then taken into cells to create energy. Growth hormone can also increase the levels of fatty acids in your blood, because we can use fatty acids to make ATP. We use growth hormone to signal protein synthesis. So it does a lot of different things around the body, even after we're done growing. Technically, it works a lot on our metabolism. So that growth hormone, how does it help us grow? Well, it goes to the liver, skeletal muscles, and bone. And when it's at the liver, skeletal muscles, and bone, it can produce insulin-like growth factors. These insulin-like growth factors help to stimulate cells to take up nutrients, to make more DNA. It helps stimulate cell division, because cells need to replicate their DNA before they can divide. It helps form collagen and deposits it in the bone matrix, because our bones use collagen. Our bones not only have calcium and phosphorus, but it has collagen in it as well. It stimulates cells to enlarge, so get bigger, divide. But growth hormone's major targets are technically bone and skeletal muscle when we're growing. So growth hormone is regulated by a hypothalamic hormone. We have growth hormone releasing hormone, and it does exactly what it says. It causes the release of growth hormone. Sometimes it's nice when hormones say exactly what they do. So growth hormone releasing hormone gets triggered by low blood growth hormone or glucose. or if we have too many amino acids in the blood, it'll get this growth hormone releasing hormone stimulated to stimulate growth hormone release. We also have growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Again, does exactly what it says, or what it's named. It inhibits the release of growth hormone. So if we have too much growth hormone in our system, we have too high of insulin growth factor in our blood, it gets inhibited. More growth hormone being released tends to be inhibited. It also has, there's also another hormone that stimulates the release of growth hormone. We have a hormone that is called ghrelin. Ghrelin is stimulated when we are hungry. That's the hormone that says, hey, you're hungry, go eat something. So when ghrelin is found in the blood, that also stimulates growth hormone. So there's a lot of things that actually stimulate growth hormone. So here's just kind of a chart that shows all the different things that'll stimulate growth hormone, how it gets stimulated, and how it gets inhibited as well. There can be some pretty significant problems that occur if we have too much growth hormone being secreted. Children that get too much growth hormone in their system can result in giantism. So you ever see some of those, I've seen some basketball players that get really tall. They may have had too much growth hormone when they were growing up, because they can actually reach heights of close to 8 feet. That's really tall. In adults, if there's too much growth hormone being released, they get what's called acromegaly. In acromegaly, their hands get very big, their feet get very big, their face, like their facial features are very defined. I actually had a teacher in school who had acromegaly. It ended up being his cause of death. So in the long run, it can cause that problem as well. Hyposecretion of growth hormone. We're not getting enough growth hormone, especially when we're growing. That's when it causes the most problems. They get pituitary dwarfism. It's pituitary because it's hormone related. It's not related to anything else. They may get to about 4 feet tall. But in adults, if there's not enough growth hormone being secreted, it doesn't really cause us any problems. So it's only oversecretion of growth hormone in adults that cause problems. In children, they get extremely tall. Or if they don't have enough growth hormone, they get very, very short. So here's two extremes. We have a woman standing beside to show kind of, here's a normal height. Then we have a gentleman with giantism. He's extremely tall. Well, next to him, we have somebody with pituitary dwarfism. It's a very large extreme in difference in height. Your anterior pituitary also secretes thyroid stimulating hormone. Our thyroid stimulating hormone, it's another tropic hormone. I keep saying that word because it is important for lab practical. But the thyroid stimulating hormone can also be called thyrotropin. Tropin for tropic for acting on other endocrine glands, because it is produced by thyrotropic cells. This is what makes thyroid stimulating hormone is thyrotropic cells. That's why sometimes it's called thyrotropin, but more commonly known as thyroid stimulating hormone. And if you ever get blood work done, it is literally called thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH for short. So thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates your thyroid gland to secrete thyroid hormone. Again, thyroid stimulating hormone is secreted based off of what the hypothalamus tells the anterior pituitary to do. And that hypothalamus secretes thyrotropin releasing hormones when we need more thyroid stimulating hormones to send out more thyroid hormone into the blood. So it's kind of a ladder again, because we get thyrotropic releasing hormone that'll stimulate thyroid stimulating hormone that'll go out and stimulate thyroid hormone to be released. So thyroid stimulating hormone can also be inhibited. We don't want too much thyroid stimulating hormone in our blood, because then that creates too much thyroid hormone in our blood. And increased thyroid hormone in our blood can cause all kinds of problems. So growth hormone inhibiting hormone can also inhibit thyroid stimulating hormone, because they both come from the hypothalamus and travel to the anterior pituitary to tell the gland what to do. So here's kind of what I just drew before. The hypothalamus releases thyrotropic releasing hormone to the anterior pituitary. That anterior pituitary releases thyroid stimulating hormone. That goes to the thyroid gland. That thyroid gland secretes its thyroid hormones that go out to the target cells throughout the body. It just depends on if it's needed or not, on whether it gets secreted, of course. Let's look at adrenocorticotropic hormones, or ACTH. They're also called corticotrophin, and they're secreted from corticotropic cells. Again, tropic, because they act on another endocrine gland to secrete their hormone. They're telling the anterior pituitary adrenocorticotropic hormones are telling the adrenal glands, adreno for adrenal glands, what to do. So the adrenocorticotropic hormone goes to that adrenal cortex, like I've said before, to release corticosteroids, or more commonly known as cortisol. Cortisol is that stress hormone. Again, adrenocorticotropic hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, is triggered by corticotropin releasing hormone. Since cortisol helps to kind of monitor your sleep-wake cycle, corticotropin releasing hormone is actually highest in the morning because it needs to wake us up. Cortisol is what kind of helps us somewhat wake up in the morning. But there's different things that can actually affect the release of corticotropin releasing hormone. Fevers. If we have a fever, it affects it. Hypoglycemia. Hypo means not enough, too low. Glycemia, glycogen, sugars. We have not enough sugar in our system, is what that stands for. So hypoglycemia, not enough sugar. Blood sugar is too low. Stressors can alter the release of corticotropin releasing hormone that goes to that anterior pituitary for adrenocorticotropic hormone release to the adrenal glands to release cortisol. We also have what are called, I think I've said them before, gonadotropins. Our gonadotropins are FSH and LH, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. They're considered gonadotropins because they're secreted by gonadotropic cells in that anterior pituitary. Again, they have tropic in the name of the cells that secrete them because gonadotropins act on the ovaries or the testes, so they go to the next endocrine gland to stimulate the release of their hormones. FSH will stimulate the production of gametes, eggs or sperm. Luteinizing hormone promotes the production of gonadal hormones like estrogen, progesterone, testosterone. Luteinizing hormone in females can mature the follicles of eggs. We will go into detail when we get to the reproductive system, how the ovaries actually make those eggs. Luteinizing hormone can trigger ovulation. As I said before, the release of estrogen and progesterone. Luteinizing hormone in males stimulates the production of testosterone. Luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone are not found in prepubescent kids, boys and girls. They don't need to start triggering the release of testosterone, estrogen, progesterone. They don't need to start having menstrual cycles. They don't need to start developing male and female characteristics at a young age. So we don't find those hormones in children. In women as well, decreased levels of FSH, that's what tends to be used to start determining if women are going perimenopausal and then into menopause. So as that number gets lower and lower, it starts signaling your body to stop menstruations. It stops the ovulation. You're not releasing as much estrogen and progesterone into your system anymore. So that's the hormone that's usually checked in the blood of females as they get older to kind of tell where their body is at with menopause and perimenopause, which is where you're kind of going in and out of menopausal type symptoms, but you keep going back to not being again. So the the hypothalamus will start sending gonadotropin releasing hormone to that anterior pituitary gland to start secreting FSH and or follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone during puberty. This is what kind of triggers the start of puberty, is when these hormones start getting released. Then they continue to be released after puberty. Luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone do get suppressed by gonadal hormone. It's kind of a feedback hormone that says, okay, we don't need any more. Don't stop sending us so much of these hormones. Is kind of what it's doing. So they kind of have their own feedback mechanism to slow things down. And then each month, kind of, especially in females, the levels get higher again, and then they go back down, then they come back up, and they go back down. It's just kind of a cycle. Another anterior pituitary hormone is prolactin. Prolactin is secreted into the blood from the anterior pituitary. This is not a hormone that acts on another endocrine gland. This is a hormone that on its own stimulates something and it acts on cells in the body. So in females, it stimulates milk production. Males, we don't really know. So prolactin is released kind of with oxytocin to help stimulate milk production. Just like all other hormones that come out of the anterior pituitary gland, they are regulated by prolactin inhibiting hormone, which is actually dopamine. Dopamine is a chemical released by our brain. So prolactin inhibiting hormone actually prevents the release of prolactin until it's needed. And then as the levels of prolactin and prolactin inhibiting hormone as the prolactin inhibiting hormone levels decrease, that's what causes lactation. So as estrogen levels get higher, they actually stimulate the release of prolactin, and your estrogen levels increase right before your menstrual cycle. So that's where breast swelling and tenderness that happens during your menstrual cycle, like right before and first couple of days usually. That's why we get prolactin we get prolactin released, and it actually causes that breast swelling. Don't have to be pregnant to have prolactin be released. Towards the end of pregnancy, prolactin also increases greatly in the blood. As babies are suckling, that stimulates more prolactin release. It helps continue the milk production. And that's also what stops the milk production. When the suckling kind of stops, you stop secreting prolactin and milk production slowly stops. Men do make prolactin, but as I kind of said up here, we don't really know what it does. Yes, we just don't really know what prolactin does to men. But they do get, for the most part, they get most of the same hormones as women. They just don't get the estrogen and progesterone, and we don't get their testosterone. So let's look at what can happen if we have hypersecretion of prolactin. We get too much prolactin. That's more common. So hypersecretion just means you're producing a lot more milk. You have one lucky baby. Hyposecretion. It is a problem. It does happen. It's really only a problem for women who try to nurse, and they're just not able to produce milk for their baby, or they're not producing enough milk for their baby. So that's the only time not having enough prolactin causes a problem. If you're not pregnant, not trying to feed a baby, nurse, then it's not really a problem. Hyperprolactinemia is common. Well, it's commonly related to pituitary tumors. There are tumors that can grow on the pituitary gland, and then it can cause over secretion or under secretion of things to happen. So hyperprolactinemia, you get inappropriate lactation. You're not pregnant, you're not trying to nurse a baby, but you're lactating. That's inappropriate. That should not be happening. A lack of menses. That can happen. Infertility. That can be a cause of infertility in females. Here's one thing that seems to show with men with hyperprolactinemia, so prolactin, that hormone. If they have hyperprolactinemia, it can cause impotence in males. That's also not a good thing. So I have several slides here with the charts. I'll update the PowerPoint I have up on Canvas, because these pictures are a lot clearer than the one that I have up there. These ones you can read, so I'm going to make sure to put this one up. I was just editing the pictures right before class. So here's all the different hormones, what stimulates them, what inhibits them, and what these hormones act on. It also shows what happens if we have hypersecretion or hyposecretion. So too much or not enough of the hormone being secreted. Like oxytocin, we don't know what that causes if there's not too much or not enough. I'd kind of guess with hyposecretion, if it with childbirth, if there's not enough oxytocin stimulating contractions of the uterus, would the baby want to come out? I don't know. That's just my thought process. Shows what antidiuretic hormone. It affects the kidneys. It tells the kidneys take up more water. Don't release so much water into urine. It can cause diabetes insipidus if it's too low, because then we're losing too much water. Or syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretion if it's too high. So they're usually retaining water somehow, somewhere. Growth hormone. That growth hormone acts on the liver, muscles, bones, cartilage, other tissues. It can cause pituitary dwarfism or giantism. Can also cause acromegaly in adults. And here's all the other hormones from the anterior pituitary. We get thyroid stimulating hormone. Causes hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism. When we get to the thyroid gland, we'll talk about what that is in more detail. We have adrenocorticotropic hormone, which goes to the adrenal cortex. A low amount of ACTH is kind of rare, but high amounts, because actually low amounts cause Addison's disease. When we get to the adrenal gland, we'll look at that too, because we'll look at what Addison's disease is and what Cushing's disease is. Follicle stimulating hormone. What it's stimulated by gonadotropic releasing hormone. It goes to the ovaries and testes. If we don't have follicle stimulating hormone, or if we have a hyposecretion, not enough of it, you're not going to reach sexual maturation. Or if there's too much, it says there's no important effects. Luteinizing hormone. It's also stimulated by gonadotropic releasing hormone. Again, goes to the ovaries and testes. The same problems that FSH causes. Prolactin. Prolactin stimulates lactation. If it's too low, you don't produce, you have poor milk production. If you have too much, you have inappropriate milk production. Can also cause a cessation of menses and impotence in males. So there's lots of problems with prolactin if we don't have it. Let's call it a night there, because there's a lot of, once we start getting into each of the individual glands, we're going to go into quite a bit more detail. And I think this is a lot of information to kind of take in, along with getting ready for the exam on blood this weekend. So let's leave this here. We'll kind of review these charts again next Thursday before we add each of the individual endocrine glands and what they do. Each of those hormones do next week. So if you have any questions, you can let me know. Otherwise, have a good night, a great weekend, and enjoy having Monday off because it's Labor Day.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Goodbye. Have a good weekend.
Thank you, you too.